Thank you, Jack.
You're so welcome.
I've always thought that this song showed off Jack's the absolute best. Thank you, Jack. And thank you, Chase. Make sure it's high. No double chins. I never tell you what to do. I'm afraid of you. And now we switch from the age of Aquarius to the fatal belief. And this is a class review. Now I want you all to imagine that you are students preparing for your final exam in the socio-history class in 2050 AD. You are the graduating class, and our future depends upon you. And I notice a few of you played hooky today. But that's not unusual. Do you realize that 2050 is only 30 years in the future? Now look around at your classmates. Imagine that you're all students studying for your PhDs, and this class today is a review of your final exam on galactic evolution, the Earth's great mistake. This will put the subject of today's talk into a new perspective, and a new viewpoint always gives you new insights. Consciously changing your perspective is a way to open your mind to new possibilities. Slide 2. Oh, it's there. This is a new possibility. Would you rather be this age or? Switch back again. And back. All it took was to get something reversed. And that's what Earth did. And that's what caused its fatal belief. And I just got chills thinking of it. Now open your teleprompters, please. Well, the class now, you will remember that my last lecture was called, "But I'm Only Human." It described the fatal belief that our race made thousands of years ago that caused the evolution of our species to come to a standstill for centuries. What was that fatal belief? The belief that they were only human. Worms of the dust. And what did that do to them? We shall see. Now naturally today in 2050, it's easy for us to see how ignorant they were. Because we all know that we create our own reality with our thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. Whether they're true or false, it's common knowledge, of course. But they didn't know it yet. So this one belief that they were only human rendered them powerless over the outer world. They had no idea that they were the source creating their own reality. And so it made them subject to the very earth that God in Genesis gave them dominion over when he created them. Today, of course, one of our slogans is perception is reception, or what you perceive is what you receive. We know that everything real is good. Why? Because there's one presence, good. And that is reflected as reality when you see the truth. It's so simple. But our poor, ignorant ancestors, thinking they were only human, created terrible illusions that appeared so real to them. They became a race of powerless human beings with no clue that they were the source of all their own problems. They used to say, oh, let's offer it up to God because God wanted this to happen. What kind of God would that be? Somebody you'd want to worship or somebody you'd want to throw out? Unfortunately, of course, they also had thoughts that were good and bad. So not knowing their real creative power, they created a world that was both good and bad. And that became known as the analogy of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Before that, you see, the race had known that there was only one infinite God, one force that manifested itself in infinite forms. So their world was always perfectly beautiful. They called it paradise. Now, of course, today we all know that beliefs, true or false, produce all our external appearances. We know that our world exactly reflects what we have faith in or what we believe to be true, whether it's true or not. Talk about appearances can be deceiving. And this one fatal belief and its crippling effects dominated the world for over 20 centuries. It's hard for us to imagine today, but as recently as just 30 years ago, I know it's hard to imagine the race was dumb enough to swallow something this obvious, but they actually thought people could die. But you'll remember, class, that 6 centuries before that, they all believed the world was flat. And that shows you how much one wrong belief can affect reality. These humans had no idea they were divine. They wouldn't have believed it if you'd told them. And when somebody did go back and try to tell them, they crucified him. That's how backward and vicious and stupid humanity became. All because of one fatal belief. Even today, a few of our own people stubbornly refuse to believe it. We told them the truth would set them free from their self-inflicted horrors, but do they believe it? Nope. Here it is, the year 2050, and there is still a group that refuses to believe we can travel to other galaxies through stargates or wormholes. Anyway, many of our ancestors believed all these lies, despite the fact that their own recognized book of authority the Bible told them that they were divine. Those of you who had incarnations on earth will remember the Bible. And I'm sure most of you have had incarnations on earth. You're very old souls. And this Bible was written thousands of years ago for our primitive ancestors. Consequently, the knowledge in this great book had to be disguised in story form so they could at least be spoon-fed and begin to see symbols that suggested the deeper truths. Pablum for babies, so to speak. The writers knew that as the race matured, they would be able to go deeper into the symbol, disrobe it, and see what it really meant. Now today, class, we will review a couple of these symbolic examples. If any of you want to do further research, start with Luke 1. Now pay close attention, class, because this could be on the exam. The Annunciation is the first thing we will look at. Now, in this case, using the slide, I showed this as a cocoon. You'll see why. In this story, see the angel? He brought the news to a virgin named Mary, who was engaged to a man named Joseph. He actually came to her and he told her that she would bring forth a son to be called Jesus. But Mary said, "How can this be? I am a virgin. I know not man." And he told her, "The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God." Now, instead of trying to understand the deeper meaning of this analogy or this metaphor, the church confused women for centuries. They held up a virgin mother as the impossible ideal, an impossible contradiction as a role model for women. It's no wonder schizophrenia was quite common in those days. Wouldn't you think someone would have thought to examine this and look for a deeper meaning? Well, the clergy certainly didn't. Of course, any mature person would have questioned these impossible ideas. This shows you how unevolved our race was 30 years ago. Now, from our 2050 perspective, let's see what the Bible writer really meant. I have your attention, don't I? First, the writer purposely chose an impossible analogy. Everybody knows that babies are born the usual way, and it takes a man and a seed and a mother to have a baby. Have you ever seen a picture of the pregnant Virgin Mary, by the way? The angel who pronounced her pregnancy represented an idea, a conception, coming from a dimension higher than the physical. This true idea can only be heard by the feminine receptive nature in humanity. The writer stressed this concept, this conception didn't come from any man. And notice that Mary, symbolizing the individual mind or soul, had to agree to accept this idea. A lot of people miss this when they read the story. She said to the angel, "Be it done unto me according to thy word." The race could not automatically do this as part of automatic evolution. It had to be an individual decision that each one of them had to make. They had to accept this idea, embody it, and later deliver it into the world. The writer naturally thought he'd succeeded in making it totally obvious that this wasn't the literal truth, since everyone knew it was impossible for a virgin to have a baby without contact with a man. But her virginity was even stressed, the Virgin Mary, to show that did not mean a human male had implanted something in a body of a female. So what was conceived? What was this conception? This idea implanted in the mind. It was the idea that the Christ, God, actually was within her body. And that's why she was depicted as a virgin, to show there wasn't a physical cause, that it had to be something invisible that you couldn't see. This analogy was supposed to show members of our race what to expect when one of us feels the idea of our internal divinity, our internal power stir within his or her mind. It's so obvious. How could the race have missed this idea for so long? Did you make a note on your teleprompters? Incubation. The new idea of divinity within us is not born, nor does it manifest overnight. It develops slowly, like the growth of a baby. And it takes time before it's produced in our external world, as I think many people in 2020 knew. But what a great analogy when you finally get it. The Bible tells us the babe in the womb, the idea of divinity, must be nourished and protected within us for a time. And finally, the symbolic babe is born in a manger and not a palace. Why? Obviously, this again was an extreme contrast the writer used to make a point which was missed. Why wasn't the baby born in a palace that was later the Christ? Why? Because each human mind is far from a perfect palace when the idea hits us. The animal nature is strong and still present with us. And this is what was represented by the cows and the sheep attending Jesus' birth. So a manger, a crib for our perfect idea, was a perfect analogy. This true idea sometimes takes years to mature. Otherwise, the people in 2020 and 2010, they would have all disappeared into another dimension like we did. But eventually the Christ will be produced in each one of us. Mary will have delivered. We have awakened the truth of our divine nature, the truth of our being, when we realize we are finally powerful, immortal beings whose every thought creates something. Belief in our divine nature opens a door to us, to higher dimensions. Remember, Jesus said, "I am the door." I always used to wonder, the door to what? But the idea of the birth of Jesus in us opens the door to the higher dimensions. How did the Bible portray the end of Jesus? This is the second analogy. It was another picture book story, kind of like Jesus and Mary in the manger. It was full of symbols. It was written that he was reviled and crucified on a wooden cross, where he took 3 hours in an agonizing death. Now, when you look at this picture, does this tell you that we are powerful beings? Unfortunately, churches fixated on this end, this crucifixion, the cross of death. And it became the symbol in almost every church, and still is in the few that are left. They almost ignored the resurrection and transfiguration, the very purpose that Jesus came to earth for. It was to give us life more abundant, not death. But let's examine our second example and demystify it for the exam. You may be asked this. Most people haven't thought of this. The hill where Jesus was crucified was called, does anyone remember?
Golgotha.
Golgotha, right. And what does it mean? Aha,
Skull.
the place of the skull. This was a clue. What really died lived in Jesus and mankind's skull. The death, not of Jesus, but the death of the fatal belief that we are human. And when Jesus died in Matthew 27, it was written, "And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom." The veil that was ripped open was the body, the human costume that Jesus wore that concealed his divinity so he could walk among earth in the primitive group that he was seeing. And when he died, that veil tore and allowed his divine body within to escape its prison, its cocoon of flesh. Death was manufactured by the fatal beliefs of our race. As people matured, people were meant to realize that the crucifixion was just that, a fiction. It represented the death of a false idea that men were only human. Oh, that is magic. Our ancestors were meant to focus on the results of Jesus' apparent death, not his crucifixion. Remember, at that time, death was normal for people. I know it's hard to realize. The execution of criminals on the cross in those days was not even a rarity. So what was unique about Jesus' death? What was the Bible trying to tell people? It was pointing to the first example of someone choosing death to demonstrate life, resurrection, and transfiguration, and then finally ascension to those higher dimensions that we now occupy. As long as the race continued to believe in aging, disease, and death, they continued to experience it. Now, the Bible specifically said that Jesus rose from the dead and rose in a burst of light above the earth. But again, the church kept a cross as its symbol, the exact opposite of what Christ taught. And this focused, by the power of suggestion, generation after generation, on the idea of agony and death being acceptable and accepted. But he came to demonstrate the resurrection, to reveal the divine being within all of us. Paintings of Jesus' transfiguration always show him in a robe of brilliant light, and he's ascending into the clouds higher. Throughout history and even today, if you do well on this exam, someone will say that you are brilliant, or at least bright, or maybe you're even illumined. Light has always been the symbol of consciousness and awareness. Jesus even said, "I am the light of the world." No one took him literally. They took the Bible literally in the wrong places, like 69 and 96. They got it backwards. And when it was literal, they missed it. His resurrection body was a light body that ascended above the gravity of the grave and of the earth. But the people of the 21st century still had no idea they could fly out of their cocoons like the monarch butterfly and rise to the kingship of their own divinity. Just realize, class, how fortunate we are, knowing from the time we're born that we're divine. Our whole race has finally discovered the truth that set us free, just like Jesus promised 2,000 years ago. We now know that we're not separate from God, but one with God. Even in the old days, this truth was taught by a religion called unity. Their churches around the world affirmed this every day, but few people listened. There is only one presence and one power in the universe, and in my life, God, the good omnipotence. They were advanced thinkers leading the way to the evolutionary break. Now, what could our class of 2050 teach the class of 2020? If we could go back in time, and we can now, of course, I know. How could we have saved them? Let's talk to them now. First, you need to banish the one fatal belief that has made the world you see, with the peaceful politics and the no wars. Actually, no, not this world, that's the imaginary world. the divisive world that they lived in then. And you have aging and you have disease and death. And why? Because you think you're human. You're not human. You are infinite. That's a very important word. I don't want to miss it. You are infinite God, having infinite forms, experiencing infinite things. I mean, look around at each other. We have a nose, two eyes, a mouth, and look how different we all are. What an imagination God has. So you can imagine that he would want to be everything and nothing and all of us. I think of all our experiences, if we could roll them up in one and see them, we wouldn't believe them. We would think each of us was telling a lie or making a movie that was never published. All of you are God's. Remember that and start acting like one. Challenge those beliefs. Make sure that only the good, the true, and the beautiful are what you believe. Class of 2050 AD, make our galactic college proud. I know you will all graduate to ever higher dimensions. God bless. Good luck. Class is dismissed.